welcome to the Dancast. It's a privilege today to be here with Mike Dudas, iconic diver of the Northeast Atlantic and, far beyond. So I would just love to begin talking with your background. I understand that you grew up in a diving family and are part of its history in a way that most of us can't even imagine. So would love to talk about your introduction to diving and your family.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate you having me on here. I was introduced to scuba diving, well, I don't know, it's been my entire life. My parents started wreck diving in the New Jersey coast in the 1960s, so before I was born. And then they had a dive shop. So I grew up around that my entire life and I think I have a benefit of seeing and meeting people throughout the entire duration of when scuba diving is popular. So it's kind of a unique, I shouldn't say unique, but it's an interesting perspective to bring to things. So I myself learned how to dive, officially learned how to dive when I was 14, and that same year did my first New Jersey wreck dive, and along with my mother, who was owned the dive shop at the time, and was introducing people to wreck diving. And then a few years later, found a dive buddy and kind of went out and started doing it a little bit on my own. And then doing dive travel to destinations, wreck diving destinations around the world. And then through that, met some folks that were diving the Andrea Doria and got my first invitation in 1998 to go dive the wreck. And then basically at every opportunity that I've been able to, I've gone back, as recently as last summer. Who knows where this summer will take me, but taking it day by day. Yeah, so that's the brief history there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I would love to delve into the Andrea Doria. Mm-hmm. When I first heard about it, it was called, the Mount Everest of scuba diving, and it seems to really have so much allure to divers and has its entire, I guess, I'm not sure that quite the first year was diving. I know it's the 70th anniversary of the sinking, and it sounds like your family became involved in some of the early wrecks after that, and your mother, I believe, was the first woman to dive it. So
absolutely.
I'd like to talk about, the early days of it and your mother's role, and then maybe delve into some of your first dives on it as well.
Sure,
in the 90s and beyond.
So my father first, he dove on the first, what would be called recreational, probably be technical diving expedition to the Doria in 1966. There's a few legends of Northeast diving, George Hoffman and Mike Dudas. They went and organized this first expedition. It was on a fishing boat based out of Montauk, New York. They had to go and bring 2x4s and plywood to build bunks to stay overnight out on the boat. Finding the wreck was a little bit of a challenge, which is why they went with one of the fishing boat captains there. And they successfully executed that first wreck diving expedition out there, and then the following year they went back, and my mother joined the expedition that year. One of the neat things that was recovered that year, my father recovered the cover of the compass and the compass itself from the ship's bridge. It's a unique artifact to the ship, but unbeknownst to everybody, within a few years the bridge would collapse, and that became, until very recently, the only equipment that was recovered from the bridge part of the ship. So it was kind of a unique thing to see that. Prior to those, expeditions to the first wreck diving expeditions, there were some photographers for Life magazine. There's a gentleman named Peter Gimbel who was very, very involved. He dove on the wreck within 2 days of it sinking. And then he went back two weeks later to film it and photograph it for Life magazine. Mm-hmm. So there's some famous magazine covers of that. There was an expedition with commercial divers that went out there to try to do some salvage work, and they actually recovered a statue of the Admiral Andrea Doria, the namesake of the ship. That has a story in and of itself that's spread across generations. And on into the 1970s, there's a very well-known wreck diving author, Gary Gentile, started diving the wreck then, and he really popularized diving the wreck with his book Dive to an Era in the late 80s, and the discovery of ships China and things like that became accessible souvenirs for anybody going to the wreck. So really, once that book came out, it had become a well-known name here in the Northeast, and that really popularized it, I would say, internationally, and it became a destination for people to want to come over here and dive it. So just backing up a little bit with the history of the wreck, it was, even taking it back, and I'll try to keep it as brief as I can because I can get a little off the rails here. After World War II, and Italy was rebuilding, it became the flagship of the Italian merchant marine. So it was very important for the Italians to have the ship. So when it sank in the collision, it was a big deal for the Italians. And it was a big deal here in the news because it was a modern-day disaster. It should have happened with radar. So it got a lot of press coverage. Television news was a new thing. We didn't have live news coverage or close to live news coverage, so it got a lot of coverage with helicopters and airplanes because it took a number of hours to sink. Made it into magazine covers, and the new sport of scuba diving, people were able to get to the wreck. So that was very fascinating to people at the time. And even a few years later, as recreational divers became interested in it. And it sits in a little bit of a challenging environment. So I shouldn't say I'm minimizing a little bit. It sits in fairly deep water, so it's in 250 feet of water. Lies on her side, so navigating the wreck is a little challenging because everything's 90 degrees. The top of the wreck at the time came up to about 160 feet. So in diveable water, it wasn't crazy deep for people. But with the equipment limitations at the time, it was still very challenging. Very short dives. Decompression was, the theory was not well known at the time, so fortunately people weren't extending too much to get bent on those kind of dives. And then as equipment progressed and as skills progressed, it became a kind of a proving ground for a lot of people to go there. So prior to technical diving being coined in the 1990s, a lot of techniques and things like that for wreck diving were developed here. Now, one of the things that started to happen in the early 90s when I started diving is cave diving started to become popular, and there started to be some crossover between the technical diving community and the cave diving community and the wreck diving community, and they kind of all became synonymous. And so a lot of techniques from cave diving, my mother and I went and got certified for cave diving in 1993. We were pretty early adopters of it here in the Northeast, and boy did it change how we dove up here, and I think to the better. And a lot of those skills and skill sets still kind of apply today. So that's been pretty neat to be able to see it and use it on the wrecks. Let's see. In addition to the depth on the wrecks, you also have strong currents in that area. The wreck sits off of Nantucket, about 60 miles from Nantucket. And there's strong currents up on that area on the Nantucket Shoals and Georges Bank. And then we have our typical Northeast conditions of the water temperature is fairly cold and visibility can be quite poor. In the early days, there was a lot more fear of sharks, and there was a lot more, I would say, experiences with sharks on the wreck. I think that we've become a little bit wiser towards sharks these days, and they're not quite as much of a concern. Still kind of gets your heart going when you see some every once in a while, but I think it's in a good way.
Out of all your experiences diving on the Doria, is there one moment that really stands out to you?
So I'll start it off with when I first dove it. There's a mystique, and there's a little bit of the legend of the Doria. And I thought to myself the first trip, like, it's a shipwreck. I've been on, dozens, maybe hundreds of shipwrecks. How could it be any different than, going to Truck Lagoon or diving into the other wrecks in New Jersey? And I definitely recall my first dive, touching down on the hull of the wreck and swimming down the promenade deck and seeing Gimbal's Hole, which is our famous landmarks, and coming up from the dive and thinking, man, I get it. This is different. It's really different. And it's on a scale that there aren't many wrecks that we dive around the world. And so that was definitely a unique experience. It was the hook. It got me hooked from day one. And then, of course, we do like to hunt around for artifacts here, in the Northeast. And the Andrea Doria has salvage rights and salvage claims on it, which are accessible for divers. There's a few artifacts that people are looking for, but for the most part, we're allowed to take artifacts. So it's continuous to look for souvenirs. And then besides being part of a few memorable artifact recoveries, I will say a few years ago I had a really, really spectacular dive. Diving the stern we had to do an early morning dive, very early, like dawn, in order to get the boat rolling and get back to the dock on a reasonable hour. And I just remember being in the very stern, and we had really nice clean visibility. The sun was coming out. It was getting brighter underneath there, and I didn't have an agenda. I was just looking around, and I just thought, man, this is just such a cool thing. And it's just a couple of years ago I had this dive, and that one's really stuck in my mind. It's just a great dive. It's a great dive. So yeah, there's definitely some good ones. Yeah, for sure.
How is it, you've seen it for decades now. How has it changed over time, and are there new hazards?
Absolutely. So I mentioned a little bit back when they first started diving the wreck, the edge of the hull and some of the places that were accessible were about 160 feet of water. And the sand was, sand, mud, whatever you want to call it, was about 250 feet. But people rarely went that deep. You didn't need to. You could get into parts of the wreck that weren't that deep. When I dove it in 1998, it was still fairly intact. About 2 years later, we don't know exactly when, but right around 2000, 2001, a lot of the structure of the wreck started to collapse, and some of the interior decks started to peel outwards. So it became a little less. It used to be you could look at the deck plans and you could plot your dive out exactly where you wanted to go. Through doorways, through rooms, and you could know exactly where you were. Table stands were bolted to the floor, so you could figure out if you were in a dining room or a salon or a bar. So a lot of that became a lot more harder to navigate. So it's a little bit more of a scavenger hunt these days, and we have to go a little bit deeper. So now we're going down into the wreckage more towards the bottom. So it's become more technical in that sense. A lot of times we dive the wreck and we hopefully can get the anchor line in the bow or the stern. That's easy to tell what you're looking at. The rest of the wreck in the middle, the anchor might land in that center part of the wreck, and you spend the whole trip trying to figure out where you are. Always looking for goodies, but so it's become a little bit more, it's different. It's different than it was before. I think it's still a great wreck dive. I think that it's still a really neat thing to go and see. Just last year, my very good friend Joe Masrani found another compass that was on the edge of the bridge in the debris, and he and another friend of mine spent the entire time working that out while we were all looking around for other things. But there's still goodies and things and neat stuff to be found, and there's still stuff to see. The anchors are still up in the bow. We can still see the letters on the bow. So there's still landmarks to be seen there, too. So I think it's still a very good wreck, a very interesting wreck to dive, yeah.
And hearing about how long divers have been exploring it, I do just wonder about the evolution of safety and planning. And I guess it was probably, just must have been just deep air. And I'm kind of curious what it might look like, diving it today versus, when your mother and that generation was exploring it.
So there was, at the time that my parents dove it, it was just air diving. They were diving double tanks. My mother likes to talk about how it's the first time she ever dove with a pressure gauge, so switching from the J valves on the tanks to pressure gauges. Using U.S. Navy tables for decompression, no computers. There was a bottom timer, a company called Princeton Tectonics that used to make a classic instrument that they all used. And wetsuits, not dry suit diving, so thick, maybe even 3/8 thick wetsuits and double layers and things like that. So it's come a long way since then, and then as dry suits came into the picture in the 80s, and in the 70s a little bit, people adopted that quickly. Aluminum tanks became a thing. Just seems weird to say that they became a thing, but they did in the 70s and 80s, so double aluminum tanks. As high-pressure steel tanks were introduced, they were quickly adopted here, anything that would get some more air and more decompression. Nitrox took hold up here, and Trimix very quickly after. The first time I took a nitrox course, there was only one other level, and that was Trimix at the time. So it was you learned everything you needed for nitrox, advanced nitrox, decompression procedures. You did that in your basic nitrox course. But using oxygen for decompression was a huge, huge thing here that helped shorten everybody's dive times a lot. And then again, adopting tables again, because now you needed new tables that accommodated for that decompression. So everybody became a little bit of an amateur mathematician trying to figure all that out. And then watching rebreathers become adopted, and that's really been a good step for doing the deeper part of the dives and spending more time, and then really using, and well, in addition to that, watching the transition to helium and trimix diving with open circuit, and then using that same helium for the closed circuit. So it's really neat. Scooters were a huge advancement because that's really knocked out the need or the pressure of the currents, because there's a lot of times you might get out there and the ladder's lifted up behind the boat, the current's so strong, and you just say, you know what, I can't pull myself down the anchor line. Some of those times we still don't want to get in the water, but with the scooter you can fight against it and without having to exert yourself. And now we've got heated vests and we've got dry gloves, so everybody's continuing to advance little by little with new technologies.
Definitely sounds a lot more comfortable than the early days wetsuits.
It can be, but so along with all that, people are extending their bottom times. So whereas you used to have maybe 10 or 15 minute bottom times at 160, 170 feet, maybe up to 200 feet, now people are doing, I don't care to do it. I'm a little bit older these days myself, so I try to limit my bottom times. But there are some folks doing 40 to 45 minute bottom times with the rebreathers, and they're perfectly safe with as far as the capacity to do it and with the bailout gas that they have. But that's where you need the heated vests and P valves and things like that, where you can comfortably do maybe up to a 2 or 3 hour decompression on top of your dive. So it's changed. It's interesting that this shipwreck has been able to kind of be there to be a place where we can exercise all these skills and still have that attraction to want to go there. It's kind of an interesting facet of the history of diving the Doria. Yeah.
And so most divers are never going to dive the Doria, or probably quite as ambitious of a wreck, but what is a safety takeaway or a lesson that you've learned from diving it safely that's applicable to even newer recreational divers?
So I would say probably the most important thing that I would use, the tool that I would use, is my reel, using a wreck penetration reel. Even if you're not penetrating a shipwreck, when you're in low visibility, getting back to that anchor line, and even sometimes it's just nice to have that lifeline, and this comes out of the cave diving skills that we're using. Some folks choose not to use it and spend some of that time to get back, but just having that safety factor of being able to get back to the anchor line, to get back to your ascent point, to get back to wherever your emergency is. Maybe there's oxygen hanging off the boat that you might have to access, or just simply being able to get back to the boat is kind of nice. You don't want to be floating around the middle of the North Atlantic if you can avoid it. So I would say on a day-to-day, that tool with me diving is probably the most important. And then of course that skill is, we didn't used to do that prior to learning how to cave dive, just because it's such a necessary thing for cave diving. A lot of times the divers in the 70s, 1980s, they used to carry this sisal line that biodegraded, and they had a big giant reel that they would strap to their tanks, and they would swim around the wreck, and if they got back to the anchor line, great. If they didn't, they would just send a lift bag up on that line, come up and then cut the line and let it drift back down the wreck, and that was the way people navigated the wreck. Nothing particularly wrong with that. I mean, it left a little bit of extra lines on the shipwreck, but I'm not a fan of doing that if I don't have to. Yeah. As far as on board the boat, there's a lot of different safety or different things that have been adopted over the years. There are, carrying oxygen safety kits on board. That's something that didn't always happen from the 80s onwards. I would say in the 90s that became much more important, especially when we were a dive shop and we ran charters. We would always make sure that there was emergency oxygen, on board. The rigging that we use to ascend has come out of diving in North Carolina. We call it literally a Carolina rig, so that you don't have to swim up to the anchor line at the front of the boat. You're not exerting yourself at the beginning of the dive or at the end of the dive. You're just dropping right off the, we usually do a stern entry off the boats and then drop straight down a line so you're below that surface water and swim in. So we've adopted some of that. And again, besides our personal equipment, which is continuously evolving, there's additionally, we have the safety factor of being able to easily access the Coast Guard. One of the big advents that's happened is on the boats that we're taking for granted a little bit is Starlink is a fairly new thing that boats are being equipped with, so that we can easily call emergency services if we need to, and get immediate response rather than going through a radio or things like that. So that's, I wouldn't say every boat has it yet, but I would say for any boat going offshore out of cell phone range, that's going to soon become a critical piece of equipment on board. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I understand you've done quite a bit of diving in remote destinations, beyond the Northeast as well, and led expeditions in Bikini Atoll for a number of years.
Yeah, I actually, in the early 2000s, I spent 2 seasons working there. Our season was February through November. That was an incredible experience. So my mother and I ran into somebody at DEMA in the mid-90s, and they just said, "You've got to go here. This is the coolest thing. There's an aircraft carrier, there's battleships, there's submarines, there's destroyers," and they're all just sitting on the bottom, and then they're in 180 feet of water, and it's just, they've been untouched since they were sunk in the atomic bomb testing. And I just said to my mother, "If you go without me, I'm going to be really upset." So we're going. So the next year we went with 2 of our friends from North Jersey who were wreck divers, and I had such a great time. I went back the next year, and then went back 2 years later. And then when I was there was a gentleman named Fabio Amaral who ran the resort. He started it and ran it. And he goes, "You seem to like it here." He goes, "I'm leaving next year, and my assistant, Tim, is taking over. You should ask him for a job." And I was like, there's no way. There's no way. Everybody must ask for a job coming out here. This is such a cool place. So I kicked it around in my head for the rest of the week, and on the way to the airport, I said to Tim, "If you're looking for somebody for next year, just let me know." He goes, "Be careful what you wish for." I was like, "Oh, that's not no, so that's not a bad thing." And then he called me up on Christmas Eve that year. I distinctly remember it. I was working at the dive shop, and he says, "Well, you want the job?" I said, "I'll call you back in 5 minutes." I walked into my mother's office. I said, "I quit." She says, "What?" I said, "I'm going to go work at Bikini for a year or so." So that was just such a cool. So being able to go diving on shipwrecks every day continuously. One of the disadvantages that we have diving up here in the Northeast, we're limited by the weather. So our summer months are our season. We're limited to the weekends. We don't get the muscle memory and the experience that folks diving in warmer water destinations where they're diving every day get. So it was amazing to be able to do that on shipwrecks in warm water, learn shipwrecks. It was instrumental in how I've learned how to navigate a wreck and look for things underwater, and how I look at the way wrecks fall apart. It was instrumental for learning photography, because at the time it was still film. I was using a Nikonus 5, and we could go take pictures and come back, develop our film, see what we did wrong. So we had kind of the advantages that eventually, just a few years later, came out with digital photography, where you could actually look at the picture underwater and take it again. So just learning photography and how all that f-stops and shutter speeds and all that kind of worked has informed how I continue to dive now when I'm not looking for artifacts on wrecks. I'm trying to take photos. So there's a little bit of that. But yeah, it was an incredible experience, and I highly urge anybody that wants to go and do some neat wreck diving. Bikini's, it's become a little more challenging logistically, but it is a phenomenal destination for wreck divers. Yeah, very cool.
What is it that you feel like keeps, certain divers, what's the allure of wrecks compared to, there's beautiful reefs and all kinds of wonderful things to see underwater, but what is it about them that has that appeal?
It's, that's a good question, because one of the downsides that I have for being born into it, I can't remember that time where people became, I sometimes envy people that passion that they get getting hooked on it and into it. I think there's different levels. Some people like to hunt for food. Some people like to look for lobsters. Now lionfish hunting's a thing, not quite so much up here, although we are seeing some up here. Scallops, mussels, things like that, fish. And then other folks get really into the history of it. You get, history buffs, people that do a lot of research on shipwrecks. I actually ended up doing a history degree after I came back from Bikini Atoll. So I do have a kind of an interest on the historical side of things. And I think that that's what's fascinating to me about it, is just tying these things into the past, and then kind of as I'd mentioned, there's this living history that divers keep adding onto these shipwrecks, which I think is really a cool thing. And it just keeps telling the story of the ships and bringing into the present, because a lot of times people don't even know that there were shipwrecks off of the East Coast. So we talked to, people that I talked to, oh, you go scuba diving. Where do you go scuba diving? I go, oh, New Jersey. And they go, well, you got to be kidding me. It's dark. It's green. And it's like, well, and what's there to look at? I said, well, we've got shipwrecks. And so it's forgotten if we didn't have wreck divers kind of bringing it to the forefront a little bit and trying to talk about it. And we've got a captive audience here at the Scuba Show because everybody here is kind of interested in it. But when you get outside of that and you can kind of speak to the general public a little bit more and get everybody's fascinated by it. Everybody's really interested in it. So so I think that's a big attraction for new divers getting involved in it. And it's something different. There's some wreck divers like to get a little bit like, we're the greatest, we're the best. Cave divers, I've seen it too. I think every environment's different. Every environment's interesting. I mean, I like being underwater. That's really kind of the basic thing. And then it's neat to find these like subgenres of things that are interesting. And but yeah, shipwrecks have a special. I guess I'm just bred into it.
So I would love to talk about the Northeast diving community.
Yeah.
In general, and the history you were mentioning about, the early days and the equipment and figures.
So there's been a lot of shipwreck diving in the Northeast informed a lot of how dive shops kind of came into being. I would say from Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and all along the way, almost every dive shop did dive charters into the 80s, I would say. Really with the advent of cheaper flights and catching on in the Caribbean, that's when dive shops started doing charters, and it opened it up to a broader audience. But that was really why people started a dive shop back in, I would say, the 70s and even into the 80s. And there's a few quarries. People prefer to call them lakes. I guess they were a quarry before they were a lake, where people did a lot of their training dives, and they got reputations for being a little tougher and a little bit more challenging. And there's definitely some machismo that's out there that comes with those early divers, which is a shame because I think it deterred some people from getting involved in the sport, and I think that's kind of gone away. I did a dive club presentation last fall up in New York City, and I was really, really pleased to see that the demographic had like evened out to almost 50-50 in the audience there. So I was like, this is kind of cool. So hopefully that continues too. So kind of getting a little segue there, but.
Well, one thing that comes through is how valuable having a dive community is, and
Absolutely.
The Northeast has had a rich history of that. So I'd be interested to hear about the value of those local connections in your diving has been.
So just recently I've become more involved with the Boston Sea Rovers, which is a really, really neat club and that runs a great symposium every year in Boston. We have the Beneath the Sea show that's been in New York for a long, long time. This show here in Atlantic City is the first year for the scuba show here. I think it's fantastic. I love having these kind of social environments where people can network, and it just creates enthusiasm. It is kind of, we were talking a little bit beforehand, it's become a little bit more challenging, especially for cold water diving. The equipment costs and the involvement, rebreathers aren't cheap compared to a set of double tanks. Dry suits have gotten a lot more expensive and all these extra add-ons. So the barrier to entry for a lot of people is tougher. So it's really nice to have these kind of environments where you can bring people together. And, I don't know if anybody's heard of the Andrea Doria. Certainly the people that I associate with know it, but, people that are getting new into the sport, I don't know if they do. And whether or not they're ever going to dive it, I think it's an interesting bit of our history that's, I would just hopefully continue to educate people on, let them get to know.
Well, where would you encourage them to start if someone's listening to this and they're, interested in the story of the Doria and particularly divers on it? Are there, books, resources that you think you'd steer them towards?
So, that's a great question. So there are, as I mentioned earlier, Gary Gentile has been writing. He's a very prolific writer. He's written a couple of books about specific wrecks, but he's also done a number of guides on just shipwrecks up and down the East Coast from Georgia up to Maine. And those are great books to just get a hold on and read up a little bit of history on and get some ideas of things that you might want to go visit at some point. As far as training, clearly learning how to dive with your local dive shop is critical. I would suggest if you can't become part of a community, if you don't have an active dive club near you, the dive shops, they want to also educate you further, and they're in business too, so there's that. But the side is that you get to get some more experience diving with a group of people that are enthusiastic. If you did want to take a wreck diving course, those are great introductions. To me, I think the most important class that I ever took was the full cave diving course. That's a little bit more technical, but the first stage of that, the cavern class, you learn a lot of the skills that you actually would end up using for wreck diving. That's a very important class I would recommend for people to do. And then go travel, go to warm water, just get some diving. There's nothing better than getting experience in any environment that's going to carry over. I will say that one of the challenging things that we've always had here in the Northeast is making the leap from being a scuba diver to being a wreck diver. It's a little intimidating going out on the dive boat. It's very intimidating if you're just saying, hey, I want to do it myself, and calling up a dive boat and getting on there. So if you can find a dive shop that does charters, there's still some around, at least in our area. Can't speak to other parts of the East Coast. That's critical because they can help guide you into that introduction into diving. And then from there, it's just pick a wreck, go check it out, learn that environment, get used to the cold water, get used to diving, and limited visibility. Sometimes we can have great, but it's a little bit more. It's not warm water tropical diving. Go to North Carolina. There's the folks that dive in Morehead City and whatnot. There's a few charter boats down there, or businesses, and that is a great way to get some experience diving wrecks that look like the wrecks here, but the conditions are a little bit warmer and clearer. Mm-hmm. Just dive. Go anywhere you can. That's really the name of the game. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Gosh, well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you today, and I do hope that listeners, wherever they are in their diving journey and their interest level in wrecks, I feel like there's been so many wonderful takeaways about diving safely and just, enjoying the journey along the way. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.